Okay, I think we're all set up. This is the Google Hangout for HST 102 in edX for Global Freshman Academy, and I'm Ian Moulton. I'm the lead instructor for the course, and we're going to spend the next hour or so just sort of talking about questions that people have had as the course has been going on, and try to address some of your concerns about the material we're studying and our approach to it. There are a couple of sort of large questions that we've gotten, and so I'm going to divide this sort of into two pieces, addressing the first. First, we'll talk a little bit about the whole question of the fall of the Roman Empire. What is it what we mean when we say the fall of the Roman Empire? And then the second half of the Hangout, I think we're going to move to talking about the relation between history and religion, which is something that's come up and is going to come up even more as we get into the medieval section of the course. So for the first half of the Hangout, we'll be talking about the fall of the Roman Empire, and then the second half we'll be talking about the relation between history and religion. So we often talk about the fall of the Roman Empire, and that's a phrase that we've got that goes back at least to the 18th century, where there was an English historian named Gibbon who wrote a very famous and very good book called The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And Gibbon's book, if you look at it, it's a massive, massive work of history. It's a wonderful read, beautiful 18th century prose. Seems a little old-fashioned now, but very smart, and a great book if you're interested. It is thousands of pages long. It's a very long book in 3 big volumes. And when Gibbon talks about the fall of the Roman Empire, he starts with the height of the empire in the 2nd century, the reign of the Emperor Hadrian, Marcus Aurelius, the sort of 4 good emperors who were in the 2nd century AD. And then he traces that not just to the collapse of the Western Empire in the 5th century, but all the way until the fall of Constantinople in 1452. So when Gibbon's talking about decline and fall, he's talking about a very long process that in fact lasts a lot longer than the rest of the empire. The empire only gets started around the dawn of the Christian era. And Gibbon's already talking about the decline and fall by 200 AD and follows his story for another 1,200 years. So that's not generally what people talk about when they're talking about the fall of the Roman Empire. What they're talking about is the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West, which happens in the 5th century AD. And it's even that is, you know, we hear fall, and if you fall or if I fall, then we fall, right? That's a very quick thing to happen. If you're walking down the street and you trip and you fall, you fell. Roman Empire didn't fall like that. Roman Empire collapsed over a long period of time in different ways, in different places. And that's something that we have to think about when we look at this. And of course, the Roman Empire didn't fall all at once. It split in half, and then half of it fell. The western half, based in Rome and what is now Western Europe, what was then, I guess, Western Europe, though nobody called it that, that collapsed, as did the empire in North Africa. The empire in the East survived for a long period of time and even thrived, and eventually comes to be known by historians as the Byzantine Empire, which is not a name that any of the people living at the time used. The Byzantines called themselves Romans. And to this day, if you go to Turkey, the Turkish word for Greeks is Romans, because that's what they thought of the Greeks as. The Greeks were the Romans because they were the ones who ran the Roman Empire in the West, in the East. So let's break it down. First, what happens is the Roman Empire is being run out of Rome. And that makes sense. Rome was the founding city of the empire. Everything came from Rome. All roads lead to Rome. Rome is Rome, right? Well, in the 4th century, you start to get pressure on the Roman frontiers, especially the European frontiers along the Rhine and the Danube River. And what you get there is Germanic tribes living on those frontiers that are fighting with the border police, the border armies of the Roman Empire. And this is a sort of ongoing situation. We can talk about that in a little bit more detail coming up. But because of this pressure on the frontiers, the administrative energies of the empire go to defending the frontiers. In other words, the emperors start to spend a lot more time and money on the frontiers of the empire instead of in the city of Rome. They're not in the city of Rome very often. They start establishing various cities closer to the front. The city of Milan in northern Italy becomes important at this time. A city in Germany called Trier becomes important, and various cities along the frontiers in the east are also important, including Constantinople, which is the old Greek city of Byzantium. Well, what happens is, as you get the emperors putting more emphasis on the frontiers, you actually get a system where running the empire becomes too much for any one person to do, and they start having sub-emperors under the emperors. And Roman society and the Roman system being what it was, this was a recipe for generals to have their own armies and start fighting each other. So you get a whole lot of civil wars going on between these various emperors and sub-emperors. And eventually what happens early in the 4th century is that an emperor called Constantine, who is commander in England, actually, his headquarters is at the city of York in North England, where he's protecting the frontiers up there. He gets into a civil war with other emperors and sub-emperors in the larger empire, and he wins this war. He wins this war by taking the city of Rome, and he does this at a battle just north of Rome. And at some point with this battle, it seems that Constantine decided that his troops would fight better if they followed the Christian God. Now, all Roman leaders used to have gods they felt protected them or were especially on their side. And this goes back, if you think of Homer in the Iliad and the Odyssey, you've got, for example, Odysseus in the Odyssey in Greek mythology. He's got Athena whispering in his ear all the time, telling him what to do, protecting him, helping him out. Well, the emperors thought that they deserved at least that too, and they believed that they had various gods that helped them. Julius Caesar, for example, was convinced that he was descended from the goddess Venus and that Venus would help him out. And so Constantine continues this tradition, but he makes a major change. He decides that his helping God is the Christian God. And this is significant for a couple of reasons. One is that the Christian God, of course, makes bigger claims than any of the other gods and goddesses that were worshipped in ancient Rome. The Christian God claims to be the only God, the supreme God, that there is no other God but the Christian God. The others are all made up. They're all demons. They're all superstitions. They're not real, according to Christian belief. So if you see this from a kind of power politics point of view on Constantine's part, this makes good sense. Why would you want some minor god when you could have a god that claimed that all the other gods didn't exist? It makes perfect sense from that point of view. How much religious sense it made to Constantine, we don't know. He did convert on his deathbed to Christianity many years after the battle in front of Rome. But he didn't convert right away. He waited until his death to say, yes, I want to be baptized and I want to be saved. There are various reasons he may have done this. And there's no reason to think that he wasn't sincere in his Christian belief. But the important thing is, for history, that Constantine won the battle, won the empire, and decided that Christianity was not going to be a sort of wacky cult that was being persecuted all over the place. It was going to be the official Roman religion. Well, what does this have to do with the fall of the empire? Well, one thing it has to do is that Constantine decides that because he's changing everything and he's establishing a new Christian empire rather than the pagan empire that existed before, he needs a new capital. And so he moves the capital of the empire from Rome in Italy to Constantinople on the border between Greece and Turkey near the Black Sea. This makes sense for all sorts of different reasons. Constantinople is more easily defended than Rome as a physical site. It also is closer to the frontiers, closer to the military issues that have to be done. And it's a city that is at a really important access for trade. It's a place where goods and people naturally travel. It's the exit from the Black Sea into the Mediterranean Sea. It's also the connection between Europe and Asia. It's a major crossroads. So Constantine does this for a variety of reasons. What this means for the future of the empire is that Rome becomes a sort of second-class city. It's not the center of everything anymore. Now, the people living in Rome, it takes them a while to figure this out, right? Because they're used to being the big city and they're not used to being the second city. But after a few hundred years, it becomes clear that Rome is not, it's not getting the money that it used to get. It's not getting the new buildings that it used to get. All that energy is going into building the new capital in Constantinople. So let's get back to the barbarians on the frontiers. Now, barbarians is just the standard Latin and Greek word for foreigners. And when we call people barbarians in English, we give the impression that we're talking about sort of rude, uncouth, stupid people who are uncivilized, which is often how the Greeks thought of people who didn't speak Greek. This is not really a very good description of the Germanic tribes that lived on the borders of the Roman Empire. They were in many ways just as structured and civilized as the Romans across the frontier. In fact, scholars have recently suggested that there wasn't a lot of difference which side of the Rhine or the Danube you were living on in terms of your daily life. It's just on one side you had Roman legionaries protecting you and an infrastructure linking back to the heart of the empire, whereas on the other side you didn't have those things, and so life was not as secure and not as economically viable. But the people on both sides of the river tended to be Germanic people with Germanic customs, tribal organizations, tribal religions, but also a sort of mixed society that was drawing on Roman things as well as on traditional Germanic ways of life. Now, the key thing that I think a lot of people get wrong when they think in a sort of popular way over time about the barbarians or the Germanic tribes is they think that the Germanic tribes wanted to destroy the Roman Empire, and this doesn't seem to be the case. What they wanted was a piece of it. They wanted to be able to live in the kind of economic prosperity, relative prosperity, and security that their relatives living on the other side of the river had. So why did they want this? Well, partly they wanted this because the Germanic tribes were under pressure from tribes further east. These were Asiatic tribes, the Huns. They were often nomadic people, horse people from Central Asia who were actually, they weren't settled farmers. They were raiders. They were a warrior people. They traveled. They didn't have set places they lived. They lived on horseback. They lived in tents. And they made their life by herding and also by attacking settled areas. And there is always, if you look in history, there's always a conflict between nomadic peoples and settled peoples. Nomadic people's way of life is not compatible fundamentally with cities, agriculture, irrigation systems. That kind of life where you move from place to place is very different than the kind of life of settler cities. And in America, if we're thinking of this, the history of the Native American peoples and the European peoples gives us an example. You have Native American peoples, some of whom are settled in cities, but many of whom are nomadic. And especially on the Western Plains, you get a conflict between an urban civilization coming from Europeans who have settled in Eastern North America and nomadic people living on the plains, hunting buffalo, and so on. That gives us a little bit of an idea of the contrast between the Germanic tribes that are settled and farming and so on, and the tribes that are pushing on them from the east, the Huns and so on. Well, the Goths are one of these Germanic tribes, and the Goths are living along the Danube River in the 4th century, and they ask to enter the Roman Empire. They make petitions, they make incursions, they cross the river in various ways. And eventually in 376 AD, the Romans say, all right, come in, we'll give you land, we'll give you stuff. We need people on this land anyway, why don't we let you in? And so large groups of Goths come in looking for land to settle and farm. Doesn't go smoothly. The Romans don't have enough land for the Goths. They're not quite sure where they want to put the Goths. The Goths don't necessarily want to go where the Romans would like to have them settle, and there's a lot of conflict. The Goths end up fighting with the Roman army, and this becomes a sort of constant presence. There are a series of Gothic wars, and these are often wars between the Roman imperial forces and Goths that are already in the empire, that are living in the empire, some of whom because they were invited to come into the empire to settle it in areas that were undersettled. So you get this kind of conflict, and in some ways it's an invasion, and in other ways it's useful to think of it as something of a civil war, because what you have is various chieftains fighting each other. You have, for example, the king of the Goths is a man named Alaric at a certain point, and Alaric actually has served in the Roman army. And the Roman general who's fighting him, a man named Stilicho is of Germanic descent and also is now in the Roman army. So on both sides, you have people who are sort of bicultural. They're Germanic as well as Roman, and they're fighting for various kinds of influence and power in the empire, which is the way that Roman generals had fought each other all the way back to the times of Julius Caesar and Pompey. It's just now you have these Germanic generals doing it. And one of the things that happens is Alaric, the Gothic king, in the year 410, captures the city of Rome. And when he captures Rome, he sacks it. Well, what does that mean to sack a city? Definitely, he's harsher on Rome than, say, Julius Caesar was when he took it from Pompey in the Republican civil wars. But he's not as harsh as what sometimes happens when cities are sacked in the classical period. He doesn't, for example, have mass executions of the population, which was something that often happened after a city fell by siege. He also doesn't systematically destroy the city, partly because it's very big and very well built, and that would take a long time. What they do instead when the Goths take Rome in 410 is that they take all the stuff they can carry with them, anything that's valuable, anything that's got cash value, jewels, art. They do a lot of wrecking, they do a lot of drinking, they do a lot of beating people up and raping people. They desecrate the tombs of the emperors for fun. They break into the mausoleum of Augustus and take Augustus's urn and scatter his ashes all over the place. Same with the mausoleum of Hadrian. They wreck the place, but they don't raze it to the ground. They don't do what the Romans did when they conquered Carthage, which is destroy every building, kill all the people, and sow the fields with salt. They don't do that. They move on to other conquests, and Alaric soon dies himself, and the wars go on. But what happens over time is that you start to see a breakdown of Roman infrastructure in the West. You start to see, for example, armies aren't getting paid. And when armies don't get paid, the soldiers go home. When the soldiers go home, the army ceases to exist. So whatever army it was fighting takes over the territory, moves on. The Germanic tribes that come in, they don't know where they want to go. They keep looking for better territory. So the Vandals, for example, go all the way through Spain and then into North Africa. The Goths travel all over the place too. They're not settled. They don't stay in one place. They tend to come to a place, take what it has, and then move to see if there's somewhere better a little further down the road. As the legions disappear, taxation disappears. And this is something that historians have suggested that local Roman people were happy about. If you lived in a Roman provincial town and all of a sudden you didn't have to pay tax, that was great, because Romans paid fairly high taxes to maintain Roman legionaries at the frontiers. Well, when the legionaries aren't there anymore, not only do you not need money for them because they aren't there, but also they aren't there to enforce the tax collectors. So if you don't have an army to make you pay tax, then you don't pay tax anymore. Well, that's great. You don't pay tax. This is wonderful. I like these new guys. And I met the Germanic guy who came in here, and he's all right. He's not that different than the Roman legion commander who used to be here. I can get along with him. Yeah, I paid him a little bribe, but it's less than the tax I used to pay. I think things are not so bad. Well, maybe they aren't. But what happens when you don't pay taxation is not only do you not pay for legionaries, you also don't pay for the upkeep of the roads. You don't pay for things like the grain shipments that keep the big cities going. And what you see in the Western Empire over a period of about 100, 150 years is a total economic collapse. The infrastructure collapses, the trade routes collapse, the cities depopulate after Rome is sacked. There are a lot of Romans still alive and living there, but a lot of them decide that food is getting short, that the city is not the best place to be, and that they would do better if they lived somewhere else. And so Rome depopulates relatively quickly in the 5th century and goes from being a very large city filled with a lot of people to a very empty city with not very many people living in it. And you sort of see the systematic collapse of power that goes on all over the Western Roman Empire. And the wars don't stop. These local chieftains coming in, they just keep fighting each other. And after a while, it settles down, and certain chieftains get more power than others and call themselves kings or call themselves rulers. None of them dares to call themselves Roman emperor because they don't control enough territory for that to be a viable claim. And besides which, the emperor isn't in Rome. The emperor is in Constantinople. Well, why does the East not fall? Maybe that's the question we need to be thinking about. The East doesn't fall because it's the heart of the empire at this point. Now, we think the heart of the empire has to be Rome, right? Because it's the Roman Empire. But by this time, the capital has moved to Constantinople for about a century. Constantinople is where the imperial court is, or the biggest imperial court. It's also where the most money is, and it's where most of the powerful people live. Constantinople doesn't really see much of a change in these years. Life goes on much as before. The chariot races continue, the festivals continue, the games and the circuses continue, all the things that sort of characterize life in a large Roman city are going on just fine in Constantinople. The other biggest cities in the empire besides Rome are all in the east. Alexandria, cities in Syria. These places are cities in Greece. These are the sort of urban centers of the Roman Empire, and they're not used to having all that much contact in some ways with the Western Empire. The Eastern Empire, the language spoken tends to be Greek because it was Greek before the Romans got there. Alexander the Great spread the Greek language throughout the Eastern Mediterranean and into what is now Iraq and so on. And certainly in places like Syria, what is now Israel, Egypt, these are places where educated people and a lot of the common people speak Greek, and business is done in Greek. They have their Latin-speaking friends and members of the empire further west, but they don't necessarily have all that much to do with them. And when there's a collapse in the west, it doesn't really affect the east. The east is better guarded, it has better infrastructure, it has more money, it has more urban populations, it has a longer history of settled civilization with cities and organization, and it stays pretty much the same. So the west collapses and the east keeps going. And after a while, the Eastern emperors start to think, well, we should recapture and reclaim our authority in all this Western territory because we're losing tax revenue. We're not getting anything and everything's sort of falling apart. We need to reconquer the Western Empire. And the person who leads this is the Byzantine Emperor Justinian in the 6th century. And Justinian does pretty well with this. He has a great general named Belisarius. He's got a great army. It's the Roman army. It's still the Roman army, even if it's coming out of Byzantium. And he reconquers most of Italy. He reconquers a lot of North Africa. Things are looking good. He's also rebuilding all sorts of things in Constantinople. He's just built the greatest religious structure ever built in Europe up to that time, the Church of Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. Justinian is on a roll. He's also codifying all Roman law. He's getting a lot of things done. And then in the year 542, there is 541, 542, there is a plague. And when we say plague, most people think of the Black Death, which hit Europe in the 14th century. This plague was, if anything, worse than the Black Death, and we're not as aware of it because we're not as aware of Byzantine history as we are of medieval European history. And it's also taken a little, the documentation is not as good on it, and scholars have sort of in some ways neglected it. But in recent years, people have gone back and looked at the plague of Justinian in 541, 542, and they've discovered all sorts of interesting things. One is that it was definitely bubonic plague. It wasn't just a bad disease or something people said, oh, that was, everyone got sick that year. It was bubonic plague. So the same exact disease that decimated Europe in the 14th century hits the Roman world, the Mediterranean world in 541 and 542. They estimate that conservatively, so this is the low end, 25 million people died. And that's in a population that's lower than, say, the United States population today. Can you imagine what the impact would be if 25 million people in the United States dropped dead within the course of a year? That's basically, to put it in perspective, that's a city the size of Greater New York, just gone, everybody dead. And that's what happened. It killed, like the plague in the Middle Ages that we're more familiar with. It killed probably about a third of the population. An enormous number of people died. And what this meant was there was no more energy for reconquering anything. The Byzantine Empire kind of fell back upon itself. The new conquests in Italy went back very quickly to local warlords and so on. Same in North Africa. And that really sort of ended the possibility of the Byzantines rebuilding the whole Roman Empire. They had the Eastern Empire, which was the wealthier part. It was linguistically distinct in that they spoke Greek instead of Latin. They were very wealthy. They were very prosperous. They had a good military. Everything was good for them. They just didn't rule as much land as they did before. But so what? The land that was the Western Roman Empire from a Byzantine point of view was by this point becoming an uneconomically attractive backwater. It wasn't somewhere that had any great wealth in it anymore. The city of Rome was quickly diminishing to the status of a small town, and the Byzantine Empire was was fine as far as they thought. They survived the plague. It was devastating, but they survived, and they went on. Excuse me, turn that off. There we go. Done. Okay. So the Byzantine Empire survived, but on smaller territory. Now, what the next huge blow to hit the Byzantine Empire was the rise of Islam. And if you look at the rise of Islam, as we're doing in week 5, you can see some similarities in its impact on the Byzantine Empire to the Germanic incursions into the Western Roman Empire. One thing that happens is that the Byzantines exhaust themselves fighting the Persians. The Persian Empire in what is now Iraq is a constant sort of rival to Byzantium, and they're always fighting endless and very costly wars. And the Byzantines actually defeat the Persians just around the time that Muhammad is starting to preach in Arabia. And they think they've won, but they're exhausted. They've worn themselves out with this long war. Nobody wants any more fighting. And just at this point, you have this new religion, Islam, coming out of the desert, very charismatic, a lot of energy behind it, a lot of, it builds, of course, on previous Christian ideas. It basically sells itself as saying, look, this is an update of Christianity. This isn't a rejection of Christianity. It's a fulfillment of the prophecies in the Jewish Bible and in the Christian Bible and so on. So it's a familiar thing to people. Not everybody is converted. In fact, most people aren't converted in places like Alexandria and Damascus and so on, these great cities of the Middle East. But what happens is very similar to what happened in the West when the Germanic invaders came in. The Byzantine Empire had been taking a lot of tax from these people and putting a lot of burdens on them to maintain the war with the Persians. And when the Islamic conquerors come in, they say, well, we're not going to tax you as much as the Byzantines taxed you. And people will say, oh, okay, I can live with that. Taxes went down like that. Some people, of course, are converts to the new religion. It's an exciting thing to have a new religion to follow, and a very attractive one in many ways for many people. But even the ones who stay with Judaism or stay with Christianity, they accept that they are not going to be part of the Byzantine Empire anymore. The other thing was that Christians in places like Alexandria and Damascus had been persecuted by Christians from Constantinople because of doctrinal differences. And doctrine meant a lot in the Byzantine Empire, and there was a lot of controversy over things that might seem esoteric to us today, like the nature of the Trinity. What does it mean to say that Christ was a human being, but he was also a God? This generated not just philosophical debate, but street fighting and fights between various communities. And the communities in Alexandria and Damascus and places like that were often being persecuted by the patriarchs in Constantinople for being heretics. And they found it in some ways easier just living under people with a different religion than being attacked by people from within their own religion. And so we see some of the same sort of processes of social transformation in the rise of Islam that we see in the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West. But Byzantium keeps going anyway. It loses to Islam the lands of Egypt and Syria, which are very wealthy and very populous, and that's a huge blow. But in the lands of Turkey, what is today Turkey and Greece, Byzantium keeps going as a powerful regional power into the 15th century. So it's not that long ago in the huge sweep of historical time that the Byzantine Empire collapsed. The death blow, in fact, comes in some ways not from the Muslims, but from the Crusaders, who sacked Constantinople in 1204 on their way to attack the Muslims in the Middle East, because Constantinople is just so rich and beautiful and wonderful that they just want it, and they take it and they destroy it, and they do to it pretty much what Alaric did to Rome in 410. They don't kill everybody, they don't destroy all the buildings, but they take all the stuff, they disrupt everything, and that really is a blow from which Constantinople never fully recovers. They eventually kick the Crusaders out after about 100 years, but they're fundamentally weakened by this, and Constantinople falls to the Turks in 1452, which is the end, finally, of the Roman Empire. So a bit of a long discussion, but it's a long topic, over 1,000 years of decline and fall. So that gives a better idea, perhaps, of what's involved in that sort of fall of the empire. The big takeaway from this is probably just that things like the collapse of an empire are things that happen for many reasons over a long period of time. They don't just happen in a day. They're not just dependent on one or two people. They tend to be long-term structural and cultural changes, and very complex and difficult to pin down to any one reason for them. Well, I'm just going to take a little drink here. Now, in the second half of the Hangout, what I want to do is talk about some larger questions that we've had about the relation of religion to history in the course. And this has come up partly in the context of our study of the Jewish people in week 4, but also in the context of the rise of monotheistic religion in general, which is something that we're dealing with in these weeks in the course. One student wrote and asked, what are the instructors' beliefs, and how do the instructors' beliefs, relate to their knowledge of history and so on? And those are personal questions that we don't need to get into here. The important thing is that we should understand, all of us, that in this course we're looking at religion from a historical point of view, as historically significant material, as cultural history, as social history, as history of ideas and beliefs. In other words, there's no intention on the part of anyone in the course to proselytize for any religion, or to choose any one religion over another, or favor any one religion over another. What we try to do instead is to respect all people's beliefs, and also historically examine the significance of belief in the past, which is what we're really looking at here. We're looking at, what did it mean to believe in the pagan gods, in Jupiter and Aphrodite, and in all these manifestations of religion? What did it mean to be a Christian in early Rome? What did it mean to be a Christian in Byzantium? What did it mean to be Jewish in any of these places? What did it mean to be Muslim? What kinds of things were encouraged by religious beliefs, social practices? And this is really, as some students have questioned, why are we talking so much about religion? Isn't this a history course? Well, yeah, it's a history course, but religion is absolutely fundamental to the historical and social changes that we're studying in this course. Now, there may be some areas of history you can study and not pay much attention to religion, but if you're studying especially the transition between the classical period and the medieval period, and that period where you see not just the collapse of Rome in the West, but also the rise of Islam as a new religion, and the rise of Christianity as a powerful religion, because Christianity starts out very much as a sort of wacky cult from the point of view of mainstream Roman society. Christians are a small minority in the early centuries of the religion whose beliefs are just fundamentally opposed to things that everybody in Roman society just takes for granted, like polytheism. And we're still trying to understand how it was and why it was historically that Christianity was able to so successfully become the religion of the Roman Empire in the East and in the West, because that's something else. We went on long enough about the fall of the empire, but one of the things we didn't mention was the religion of the Germanic tribes. The Germanic tribes were Christian. They either were Christian when they came into the empire, or they became Christian right after they became into the empire, because for them Christianity was part of becoming Roman, and what they wanted to do was become Roman. They wanted to assimilate. And so religion, oddly enough, was not a direct source of conflict, generally speaking, between the Germanic invaders and the settled Roman population. In fact, St. Augustine, who was alive at the time as a bishop in North Africa, Augustine, one of his ways of dealing with the trauma of the sack of Rome and the dislocations of Roman society was to say that, Rome was a pagan culture initially, and maybe it needed this kind of new Christianizing. Maybe it needed a clean slate. Augustine went back and forth on this, but he certainly thought that it was a great thing that all these Germanic tribes people were converting to Christianity. He thought this was a growth of Christianity beyond its traditional bounds, and that this would be a good thing. And so even if we're looking at a political event like the fall of the Roman Empire, we need to look at a sort of the religious significance of this, because this is something that helps people understand and cope with what's happening to them. Augustine's reaction is an important one. He doesn't turn on the Germanic invaders as he could have. Instead, he sees them as brothers in Christ or potential brothers in Christ. Is he right to do this? Well, we can't really answer whether he was right or wrong. What's interesting is that here is someone who finds a way to create a new community out of sort of enormous historical dislocation and great social disruption. Augustine is finding ways to connect people around Christianity. That's not the way that everybody's going to see it, but it's an influential way of seeing it. So religion, politics, warfare, all these things are very, very closely related. And we haven't even talked yet about the Crusades. That's next week. But all of these things are sort of key. Now, when we're studying the earlier periods of the course, when we're studying Egypt or Mesopotamia or Greece and Rome, religion may seem to us to not be all that important because none of the religions that are practiced in these periods are still alive today. There's basically nobody today in any great numbers who's worshiping Ra or Bastet or Aphrodite or Zeus, any of these gods. So in some ways, we don't take that religion as seriously, perhaps, because we don't know people. We don't share that religion ourselves. We don't know people who share that religion. It seems like a bunch of strange beliefs from long ago. But of course, religion was fundamental to Roman culture. There were people who were skeptical about religion. Philosophers were, some statesmen were. In all periods, there are people who are skeptical of religion. But people still followed the rites. They consulted soothsayers and oracles, which was a fundamental part of pagan religion. They prayed to their household gods. They had shrines. They did various purification rites. They joined various religious confraternities. This was a major religion, played a major part in the lives of Greek women, for example, because women, there were certain important festivals in Greek religion that could only be conducted by women. And there were also mystery rites that only women could know. And this was true in Rome and Greece. And this gave a focal point to many women's lives in ancient Greece and Rome. Wars were conducted for religious purposes. There were religious persecutions. There was the Jewish Wars when the Romans sacked Jerusalem in 70 AD. However, there are some differences between looking at pagan religion and looking at monotheistic religion. And one of them, of course, is that pagan religion may claim to sort of explain everything in the world, but no one god is expected to be always right or always in charge of everything. In other words, there's a multiplicity of religious belief, and this in some ways allows, in some circumstances, for religious tolerance. If I'm someone who worships Zeus and you're someone who worships Ra, well, we can make that work, either by claiming that Zeus and Ra are just different names for the same god, or by saying, well, you're worshiping the sun god, I'm worshiping the god of thunder, it's not the same thing. You can worship your sun god over there, I'll worship my thunder god over here, and we'll both go and give a sacrifice at the emperor's temple on a particular festival because we're both Roman citizens, and so we both pay our respects, religious respects, to the emperors. And of course, this is not a small thing that the Roman emperors were deified. Julius Caesar was a god. Augustus was a god. After their death, there were temples to them. There were priests of them. People worshipped them. This was a fundamental part of Roman civic culture, which we can tend to forget about these days because we often are in situations where we see or want or value a separation between church and state. This idea of a separation of church and state, which in many ways is very fruitful for religion and for civic life and for tolerance. This is not a classical or medieval idea. Nobody really is arguing that the state should not be in the business of religion or that the church in later periods should not be involved in the state. Now, there are conflicts between the popes and the emperors, the Christian emperors later on, and between popes and kings. But the conflict there is whether the pope is in charge or whether the king's in charge. It's not the pope saying, leave me alone, I'm going to do my religious thing, you do your political thing. On both sides, they're trying to get into the territory of the other. If you want to look at it that way, the popes are trying to get more political and military power. The emperors are trying to get more spiritual power, especially over things like appointing bishops, because if you appoint bishops, you can, to some extent, control what people think when they go to church, what they're going to talk about, and so on. So But back to the differences between paganism and monotheism. Monotheism, whether it's Judaism or Christianity or Islam, it makes a totalizing claim. That is, it claims that the God that I'm worshiping, if you imagine a monotheistic worshiper, is the only God, which means all the other gods are fake. They're not real. You don't need to sacrifice to them. You shouldn't. It might even be considered sinful to do so. And this is where the Jewish people get in trouble with the Roman Empire, because they won't sacrifice to the emperor. And sacrificing to the emperor seems a perfectly reasonable thing to people who have been brought up in a pagan culture where the emperor is just one of many, many gods, and his spirit is no doubt powerful. Otherwise, how would he have been emperor? And so why not worship the emperor? Why can't you do that? Why can't you do that simple gesture of respect? Well, for a Jew or for an early Christian, the answer is because that's idolatry. That's pretending something's a god when it's not a god. There's only one God, and God is God. And I can't pretend that Julius Caesar was God, because he wasn't. He was a person. That gets you into all sorts of trouble. And it's a contradictory position that can't be reconciled with the idea that Julius Caesar is a god, just like Zeus is a god, and there are lots and lots of gods. There's either, from the monotheistic point of view, there's either one god or there isn't. And in monotheism, believers believe that there is one God. And this creates challenges in some ways to the kind of religious tolerance that we have been talking about under paganism, where you can say, okay, yeah, you worship that way, I worship this way, doesn't matter, there's lots of gods, and what, always room for one more, right? This doesn't mean there weren't religious conflicts between pagan peoples, but with monotheism, it becomes a lot more sort of philosophically difficult to tolerate intellectually the other religion. And that creates real problems for coexistence. And these are problems that still exist today, as we can see, around monotheistic religions. It's one of the issues that arises when any religion claims that there is only one God, and the God is the God of that religion. Now, we had some questions recently in the discussion boards about, well, the Jewish people think they're the chosen people. Does this mean they think they're best? And not really. As Professor Rubinoff pointed out in his lecture, being chosen is not always, it's not always good to be chosen. In other words, it's not always easy to be chosen. It might always be good, but it's not always easy. The Jewish people and their God have a fairly rough relationship. If you read the stories in the Old Testament, the God is always challenging the Jewish people. God is always testing the Jewish people. The Jewish people sometimes don't understand what God wants them to do. But the general structure for the Jewish religion, at least certainly in the periods that we're studying, is that it's a matter of being part of this particular ethnic group. In other words, you're a Jew because you're a child of Abraham. And as a child of Abraham, you have to follow certain rules that people who aren't children of Abraham don't have to follow. And the Jewish religion has never been very interested in proselytizing. That is, they don't, generally speaking, the Jews have not gone out and found people who believe other religions and tried to convince them to be Jewish. There are people who convert, of course, to Judaism, but it tends to be based in the notion of descent, of being part of a particular ethnic group. Christianity drops this very early on, and this is part of the reason why Christianity becomes so much a larger religion than Judaism, is that one of the things that Christians decide very early on is that anybody who wants to can be Christian. Doesn't matter if you're Greek or Jewish, doesn't matter if you're a slave or an emperor, you can become a Christian if you choose to accept Christian doctrine and follow certain procedures. The same is true of Islam. And that gives those religions enormous power to grow because they will take in converts. And you can see a parallel here in a non-religious realm to the way that Rome was able to grow, whereas the Greek city-states weren't. The Greek city-states like Athens were very powerful and at some point looked like they were on the verge of having empires, but they never extended citizenship to people who weren't from their city. They basically said, okay, we can have all these colonies and all these allies and all these subject powers, but none of these people can become Athenian, because becoming Athenian means that your mother and father are Athenian. And that's how strict it was in ancient Athens. Your mother and father had to be Athenian for you to be Athenian. And if that wasn't the case, then you weren't Athenian. It didn't matter how much money you had or what services you did for the Athenian state or how important you were or necessary politically. You just couldn't become Athenian. Very, very difficult to do in any case. The Romans very early on take the opposite approach, which is, why don't we just let everyone call themselves Roman, and then we can tax them at a higher rate, we can make them join the legions, we can make them part of our resources, we can include them in our group, and that makes our group bigger and that makes our group stronger. I think it's wrong to sort of look at this from what we can tell. This is not the Romans wanting to be sort of tolerant and friendly. This is the Romans wanting to extend their power. But the consequence of it is that Rome becomes very big, whereas Athens stays a relatively, a medium-sized city in southern Greece. And after a while, Athens' power fades, and Rome's power fades too, but it takes a lot longer, and it got a lot bigger first. So you can see these are just sort of, it's not really about religion or politics. It's about the ways that organizations grow, and organizations like the Roman Empire and the Christian Church grow by making themselves inclusive, by allowing people in. So really, if we're looking at this whole question of religion and history, you can see it's really almost impossible to separate out the two. And this becomes even more the case when we get into the study of the medieval period, which we're starting to do, because one of the things that happens in the Western Roman Empire especially is when you get all that political collapse that we talked about in the first half of the Hangout, what survives? Local communities, maybe. Certainly the army doesn't survive in the West as any kind of unified unit. You have all these warlords with their particular bands of followers. The one thing that survives is the church. The church organization stays the same. In fact, the church becomes stronger. The Pope, who is initially just the Bishop of Rome, becomes the Pope. He becomes the leader of all Christians in the West. He tries to become leader of all Christians in the East too, but Byzantium is powerful enough that they resist papal power, and they say no. The Patriarch of Constantinople is equal in status to the Pope of Rome, and this eventually leads to a split in the churches, where you have the Catholic Church in the West, the Roman Catholic Church. It's called Roman Catholic for a reason, and then the Eastern Orthodox churches, based in initially in Constantinople and then later in Greece and in Russia. What you have here is a sign of how the church in the West sort of pulls itself together and organizes itself. One of the things that the church does is it sets up monasteries, which are communities where religious people can sort of isolate themselves, and this provides possibility for learning to continue, because one of the things that collapses in the West is writing. Fewer people learn to write, fewer people learn to read, fewer people are educated, records aren't being kept. One of the few places that these skills are kept alive is in monasteries, which are these sort of fortified, isolated religious communities where people go to get away from the world. But when they go to get away from the world, they create a way of sort of carrying culture through. And almost all of the classical texts that we've been looking at and reading over the last few weeks were preserved by monks in monasteries in the Middle Ages, because classical texts were written in manuscript. There was no printing. And after a while, manuscripts just wear out. If you don't recopy them every 100 years or so, after a while, they fade, they rot, they're gone. So if we still have the works of Virgil or Cicero or Homer, that's because a monk somewhere copied them down. And that wasn't the monk's main function. The monk's main function was to copy down texts of scripture and other religious texts. That was their main focus, but some of them also copied non-religious texts in their extra time, partly because they were felt to be valuable linguistic models. Cicero was kept because his style was valued, and the idea was if you wrote like Cicero, you would write good Latin, so we better keep all the Cicero we have. So that was something that was very valuable. And this is an interesting sort of thought experiment to do. If you were faced with the collapse of civilization, and you were told the only books you could have would be the ones that you took the time to sit down and write out by hand yourself on a piece of paper, how many books would you have, and what would they be? It's easy to blame the monks for not copying, for only, copying down 7 plays by Sophocles instead of the hundreds that he wrote. But if you're copying them out, but keep in mind too that paper is not cheap. In the medieval period, most paper is parchment, and parchment comes from animal skins. So how many cows are you going to kill to make your book? And how many cows do you own? These all become all sorts of important issues. But one of the things you can see here is if you're talking about a society where religion and religious structures are the only ways that non-religious ideas are kept in circulation. The idea that you can sort of divorce religion from history is it's really a non-starter. There's no way you can understand anything in the Middle Ages without looking at Christianity, Islam, Judaism as the roots of both of those two, as a sort of intellectual structure for society. And this is sort of obvious when you look at something like the Crusades, which is a war that is happening largely because of religious doctrine. But it also is important for habits of mind, habits of thought, ways that people deal with their private lives. There are enormous changes socially between the pagan world and the Christian world. And one of the changes is that slavery more or less ceases to exist as slavery. There's still servitude in the feudal system where people are serfs and peasants tied to the land and so on. But slavery as slavery, the ownership of one person by another, disappears from the Christian world. And this is largely because it is in some ways incompatible with Christian doctrine. The idea is that everyone's soul has value in the sight of God, so how can one person own another? Now, this idea is thrown out the window and lots of times over history, and of course it's Christians that enslave Africans in the 16th century and since. But within the European community, under Christianity in the Middle Ages, slavery ceases to play the role that it played, the massive role that it played in classical civilization. Sexual mores, too, are enormously changed by religious doctrine. And this is something that scholars are very interested in, is how do sort of pagan sexual norms change in a Christian world? And, the changes in some ways, from our point of view, the changes might be good or they might be bad, but there are huge changes that occur. One of the changes is that consent becomes much more important in sexual relations than it was in the classical world. Another change is that homosexuality becomes particularly persecuted under the Christian dispensation in ways that it wasn't in the pagan world. And so there are all sorts of changes in people's lives and behaviors that relate to the dominant religions of the periods in which they live. And so again, trying to understand society and history with taking religion out of it really doesn't get you very far, because when you're dealing with what people believe and care about, that's going to have an enormous impact on their civilization. Now, this isn't, of course, to say that any particular religion is true or right or good or bad. All religions have things in them that you can look at as good and bad. And that goes for whether it's a religion that a person believes in themselves or a religion that they don't believe in, that they're trying to understand other people believing. There are things that are very attractive about various religions in terms of their beliefs and their consequences. There are things that are very unattractive. The idea that any one religion is going to solve everybody's problems in a sort of human historical sense is something that study of history is going to make you very skeptical about, I think. Religious issues tend to be religious issues. They tend to be things that are dealt with. There we go. Should have just disconnected that phone. Religion tends to offer to solve everyone's problems, but the problems tend to get solved in afterlives and not in the world here. They might make some things in the world here better for some people in some ways and not necessarily for other people. Religion, as it manifests itself in human society, is a human thing, whatever divine truth may or may not be behind it. And as such, it's very much part of the fabric of history, is certainly never more so than in the early Middle Ages, the period that we're studying this week, and continuing throughout the High Middle Ages and into the Renaissance. Religion plays an enormous role in people's lives and in the sort of structure of civilizations, as we'll see as we go forward. Well, that's pretty much it. We've spent about an hour chatting, and I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope it's been useful, and I hope you're enjoying the course. If you have questions about either this Hangout or about anything else in the course, post them to the discussion pages, and the course team will deal with them. And good luck going forward with the rest of the course. And I hope you're, as I said in my introduction, I hope you're having as much fun taking it as I had putting it together and working with our team. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.